Hello, I'm Kathy Harajian. I live in Sterling and I am chairman of the Sterling Historical Commission. And we're here to document a wonderful project by the Eagle Scouts of Troop 189. It was led by Christopher Dwyer and his other scouts. So we'll bring them in now and they will speak about the project. So, first of all, we'll introduce all the here from the Scouts.
Hi, I'm Chris Dwyer. I'm the newest Eagle Scout of Troop 189 Sterling.
Okay.
Hi, I'm Aiden Schnare. I assisted with the project.
Hi, I'm Luke Boardman. I assisted with the project too.
Okay. And as the leader of the project, did you tell them what to do, all these fellows?
At some points I did, but a lot of it was self-directed. I came in and made sure that certain jobs were done and to a certain extent instructed a lot of the scouts on what to do, but especially Luke and Aiden here were very self-motivated and were in charge of a lot of the teaching of the other scouts and also came on separate days with me personally to work on odd jobs around the graveyard.
Okay, one moment. Okay, Aiden, what were some of your tasks?
Well, most of what I was doing was directing people on where to go, getting materials, and helping to actually dig out the stones so that we could reset them.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and Lucas, your tasks?
I also helped out dig up the stones and get the material in the wheelbarrows.
Okay, great. Okay, now we're going to speak to Christopher a little bit more in depth about some of the aspects of this wonderful project for the town of Sterling. So first of all, Christopher, what inspired you to take up this project?
Well, like a lot of residents of Sterling, I passed this graveyard about every day when I left town to go to school. And after a while, I actually stopped to visit the cemetery and was amazed at all the rich history that's here. There are people who were buried here before our nation was born. There are veterans from the Revolutionary War and the Civil War and both World Wars. And so much rich history of families that are still living in Sterling and families that have since moved on. And looking around, I saw so many stones had fallen over or been broken or were actually sinking into the ground. And I was worried that this history would be lost. So I actually went to the Sterling Historical Commission and asked what could be done about the situation here at Legg Cemetery.
Okay, great. So what were some of the main things involved in organizing and preparing for this project?
So first was a period of research. I went and spoke with Mr. Dave Gibbs of the Sterling Historical Society, and we talked about methods of writing stones that have been tilted over, as well as some way to contact professionals to fix broken stones. Additionally, we had to come and plot the site to know which stones were broken and which stones needed the most attention.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And can you describe some of the specific repairs that you made on the different stones and
Sure.
their problems?
So the biggest issue in the graveyard was that many stones, roughly 100 of them, were leaning over. And this makes them more susceptible to breaking or falling over entirely and being lost. But apart from that, there were also many stones that had previously fallen over and were already in the ground, so we would have to dig those up to preserve them. And additionally, there was a lot of trees and foliage that was overgrowing in front of a lot of the stones, so several trees had to be removed. And one of the first jobs we actually did was to go to the two entrance gates, which were entirely coated with rust and falling apart, and we de-rusted them and repainted them so that they'll be in good shape for the next decade or so.
Oh, no small task here. Did you use any modern technologies to accomplish this project?
The most modern technique we used was the first effort we did here at the cemetery. I went down with one of the fathers from the troop, and he had access to some GPS equipment. So we went and took a tripod that was linked with a satellite, and we were able to get GPS coordinates of all the broken stones in the graveyard. And we overlaid those coordinates with a map so that we had a detailed graphic of where all the broken stones and all the stones that needed attention were in the cemetery.
Well, that's a lot, a lot of technique. Now, is the cemetery in need of any more repairs after this gigantic project?
Unfortunately, our work really is not done, and there is a lot more that needs to be done at the cemetery. I'm very happy with what we did, but some of the things that still need to be addressed are, for starters, there are still around 20 or so stones that have shattered that we can't repair. We don't have the access to the techniques that are needed to repair stones like that. And a professional we needed to hire to do those things, but I don't believe that worked out budget-wise with the Historical Commission. So that still needs to be looked at and funded somehow. And additionally, there are, to the side of the cemetery along the road, two really big dead trees that are fairly soon going to fall over. And if they fall towards the cemetery, they'll certainly break several stones, some of the most prominent ones. Or if they fall towards the road, they'll block the traffic there in front of the cemetery.
Not a good situation, but we can only hope to preserve our history a little bit better going forward. Do you know the history of any specific people buried in the cemetery here?
I do. There's a few stones that I enjoyed learning about the most. One of them was Thomas Lynch. He's in the far corner of the cemetery, but he has one of the largest gravestones here. He was actually a migrant worker from Ireland who came here to work and unfortunately died after a tree fell on him. It's presumed that he was cutting the tree down at the time and it fell on him. But the town came together and funded this very ornate gravestone, even though he was a foreigner and probably didn't have many connections to the town. So I love that sense of community that I get when I see that gravestone. That was one of the worst for wear stones in the cemetery. It was leaning at less than a 45-degree angle, but now it's righted and standing strong. Another of the stones was Captain Davis, who fought during the Revolutionary War. His stone is also in here and was also righted. It was leaning heavily as well. And the Davis family is still present in Sterling, so it was nice to see some ancestry there. And the last one that I can remember off the top of my head that we directly worked with was Ruhama Bus. She was a member of the prominent Bus family in Sterling during the mid-1800s, 1840s, I believe. And her stone was actually a picture I found in the Historical Society building from 1970 or so. And it was slightly leaning at the time then, and when I saw it at that point later on, it was leaning even more heavily, so I could see the progression of the damage to the cemetery, but now it's righted as well. Probably the most famous stone in the cemetery, and the last one I'll mention, is the author of the Farmer's Almanac, is originally buried here. His stone is near the road in the front of the cemetery, and had broken at one point, but was repaired, and we didn't even need to address that one, thankfully.
And what do you feel is the importance of restoring these headstones for our community of Sterling?
Well, Legg Cemetery is such a huge part of the history of Sterling that a lot of people don't really realize or remember. I didn't know of Sterling history that much. I moved here in 2012 when I was 11. But since then, I've gained a great appreciation for Sterling's history, and largely because of sites like this, where there's so much rich history and preservation. I mean, even down to little things like down by the road, on the stone wall, there are still iron rings in the wall that would be used to tie up horses for people who are visiting the cemetery, and those are still here. So I think preserving the legacy of others is one of the greatest legacies that you can make for yourself. And scouting has taught me that through teaching younger scouts and being taught myself, and certainly through doing service projects like Eagle projects to help preserve sites in the town.
Well, that's just wonderful, and we really appreciate this kind of help to preserve our important history. Is there anything specifically that you'd like to talk about after having done this huge project?
Well, I would like to note the fact that I was blown away with the amount of volunteer effort that we received, mostly from Troop 189, but also working with the Historical Commission and the DPW to an extent. I expected this to take many weeks to be able to address all these gravestones. Writing the gravestones themselves, I expected to take, maybe over the course of 3 weekends, and I had marked 60 of them to be repaired. We got to over those 60, think about 70 gravestones on the very first Saturday we worked on writing gravestones, which was absolutely amazing. And over that weekend, we were able to address 98 gravestones in total, which was far above the number that I thought we would ever be able to look at. So I was absolutely amazed with that, and I'm very, very grateful to the people of Sterling and Troop 189 and all the people that I've met through them that helped achieve this great task.
Oh. Well, we can only say thank you again so much for this project, and we will look around a little bit more here at some of the repairs that you've made.
So one of the first tasks we had working at the cemetery was to repair and restore the entrance gates. So there are 2 entrance gates, and this one here was especially coated in rust and falling apart. So we came in and with power tools and hand tools scraped all the rust off. Took us an entire day, and we repainted it with primer and Rust-Oleum so that hopefully it won't be decaying again anytime soon. If you visited the graveyard last summer, you would actually not have been able to see the stone right here in front of me. At the time, it was completely covered by trees and brush that had grown in front of it and uprooted it. We had to come in and cut down 3 trees in this area and cut down bushes in front of it, and lo and behold, there was a stone here. And at that point, we did have to straighten it. It had fallen over. So as we did with roughly 70 gravestones, we dug a small trench in the front and back of the stone, and then carefully, in teams of about 3 people, we then righted the stone into a 90-degree angle position so that it could be clearly visible by visitors. Another thing we had to deal with at the cemetery was stones that had already fallen over and were disappearing into the ground. These 2 here had fallen over and sunk into the ground to the point they were barely visible, largely because of a tree that had been growing up and broken this one in 2. At that point, we came in on one day and found a bunch of stones that had sunken into the ground and excavated them so that we could lift them above the ground for professionals in the future to one day fix them. But we were not able to right those stones at the time. This line of gravestones here is a prime example of the work we did at the cemetery. All of them are connected to stone bases, and at the time we were doing the work, all of them were completely disappeared beneath the ground. We had to dig about 2 feet into the ground to actually reveal these bases and raise them up so that they could hold and support the gravestones again. This one here especially, we had to dig about 2.5 feet into the ground and physically lift the stone up and refit it into the base so that it wouldn't lean over. These stones especially are very susceptible to breaking, and without the base, many of them would have broken in the following years. These were 2 of the most difficult tasks at the cemetery. In front of each, which were leaning precariously, we had to dig 3-foot trenches down into the ground just to be able to move them without shattering them. Each of them are made out of shale, which is very breakable, unfortunately, especially when it's leaning. And we had to spend about 3 hours combined on each to right them again so that they wouldn't fall. This is the gravestone of Ruhama Bus, a member of the Bus family that was prominent in the late 1700s. She died in 1786. To put that in some perspective, that was 2 years after Washington was inaugurated as president. This stone was leaning in the 1970s when I found a picture of it, and since then had leaned severely. Luckily, we were able to right it before it could break and restore it to its original position.